The cutting laser hit something it shouldn't have, and Torven Hask saw the reflected beam change color. He had been mining asteroid 447 Kappa in the bitter vein for 6 years, long enough to know the composition of every rock in this patch of the belt by the color it bled when his laser touched it. Iron nickel gave a white-orange flare, carbonaceous chondrite scattered green, silicate deposits sparked blue. The color spectrum was as familiar to Torven as his own breathing, a visual language that his Kethari eyes had learned to read as fluently as any text. The color that came back was amber, deep, rich, and perfectly uniform, not the scattered sparkle of a mineral deposit but the smooth, reflective return of a manufactured surface. Amber was not a color that occurred naturally in the bitter vein. Amber was the color of engineered composites, specifically the kind that the Confederation military used for hull armor on its larger vessels. Torven killed the laser and sat back in his mining rig's control seat, his four arms resting on the armrests, his compound eyes adjusting to the sudden absence of cutting light. The asteroid in front of him was unremarkable, a rounded lump of rock roughly 600 meters in diameter, one of thousands that made up the bitter vein, a dense field of debris orbiting a dying star on the fringe of Confederation space. The vein was rich in heavy metals, which was why Torven was here, and it was also mind-numbingly dull, which was why he had been able to afford the claim. Nobody wanted to work this far from civilized space except people who had reasons to be far from civilized space, and Torven had his reasons. He leaned forward and activated the rig's ground-penetrating scanner, a system he rarely used because the vein's asteroids were homogeneous enough that there was rarely anything worth scanning for beneath the surface. The scanner swept the asteroid in a concentric pattern, building a three-dimensional image of its internal structure, and within 30 seconds, the display showed Torven something that made his chitinous plates tighten against his thorax in a reflex that his species associated with the anticipation of danger. The asteroid was not solid. It had a cavity, a large one, roughly 400 meters long and 100 meters wide, running through the asteroid's core in a configuration that was not geological. The cavity was oval with smooth walls that the scanner could not fully penetrate, and it contained something that was reflecting the scanner's signals in a pattern that was consistent with a solid object of considerable size. The object was too regular, too geometric to be a natural formation. It had edges, it had corners. It had a shape that the scanner's imaging algorithm was struggling to resolve because the material it was made of was interfering with the scanning frequencies in ways that the system's designers had not anticipated. Torven stared at the image and felt something he had not felt in 6 years of mining the bitter vein. Curiosity. Real curiosity, not the idle speculation about what mineral deposit might lie beneath the next layer of rock, but the sharp, focused attention of a mind that has encountered something that does not belong. He ran a second scan at higher resolution. The image sharpened and the shape inside the asteroid became clearer. It was a vessel. A ship embedded in the rock like a fossil in sediment, its hull covered by a layer of mineral accretion that had built up over millennia until the ship was no longer visible from the outside. The ship was large, filling most of the cavity, and its configuration was unlike anything in Torven's experience. The hull was angular, with protruding structures that his scanner identified as weapon mounts, and a raised superstructure near the stern that contained what appeared to be a command section. The design language was unfamiliar, but there was something about the proportions, the relationship between the major sections, that nagged at a memory that Torven couldn't immediately place. He pulled up the rig's communications system and hesitated. The nearest station was Gateway Hub, 14 light-years away, and the nearest Confederation patrol vessel was even further. Reporting the find would trigger a bureaucratic process that would take months, during which time the asteroid would be impounded, his claim would be suspended, and his income would stop. Torven had debts. He had obligations. He had a life that was held together by the thin thread of his mining income, and breaking that thread would cause everything to unravel. But the ship was inside his asteroid, his claim, his legal right, and the amber color of that hull composite was military grade, which meant the ship was military, which meant it might be worth something to someone, and Torven had spent 6 years watching his labor enrich everyone except himself. He picked up his cutting laser and went back to work. Careful. Lie this time precisely, cutting not to extract ore but to excavate a ship. It took 3 weeks. Torven worked alone as he always did, his mining rig's lasers carving through the asteroid's rocky exterior with a patience that surprised even himself. He was not a patient being by nature. Kethari were built for speed and precision, for the rapid execution of complex tasks using their 4 arms and their exceptional spatial reasoning. But this work required a different kind of patience. The patience of someone who knows they are uncovering something important and refuses to damage it in the process. He cut in layers, removing the rock in thin sheets that fell away from the hull beneath like skin from a wound. The amber composite became more visible with each layer, and as more of the hull was exposed, Torven began to see details that his initial scan had missed. The hull was not smooth. It was covered in a fine texture, a pattern of ridges and channels that gave the surface a quality almost like fabric. The weapon mounts were not just protrusions, but complex structures with multiple barrels and emitter arrays that suggested a level of firepower that Torven found deeply unsettling. The command superstructure was dominated by a transparent section that was not, as Torven had initially assumed, a viewport. It was a dome made of the same amber composite, but in a form that was transparent from certain angles and opaque from others, a sophisticated optical material that served purposes Torven could not guess at. After 3 weeks, the ship was free. It emerged from the asteroid like a bone from a clean joint, a massive, dark, angular shape that hung in the void surrounded by the debris of the rock that had encased it. Torven positioned his mining rig alongside it and ran a full sensor sweep. The ship was intact, not just structurally intact but functionally intact. The hull showed no breaches. The weapon mounts, while retracted, appeared undamaged. And the ship was emitting a faint energy signature, so faint that it had been undetectable through the asteroid's rock but was now clearly present, a low-level power output that suggested active systems running in a standby state. Torven's compound eyes widened. Active systems. After however long this ship had been buried in the asteroid, something inside it was still running. He ran the ship's configuration through his rig's identification database. The database searched through every known vessel class in the Confederation's records, including the historical archives of all member species. The search took 4 minutes and returned no matches. The ship was not in any database. It was not a Confederate vessel, not a Valyrian design, not a Torsen construct, not any known variant of any known species shipbuilding tradition. But the database had returned a partial correlation. Low confidence, only 29%, but present. The correlation was with a design category labeled as speculative human preconsolidation military architecture, a theoretical classification based on fragmentary archaeological evidence from the period before humanity had joined the Confederation, roughly 12 to 15,000 years before the present. The correlation was too weak to be conclusive, but it was enough to make Torven's memory finally produce the association that had been nagging at him since the first scan. He had seen proportions like these before, not on a ship, in a museum. The Confederation's Museum of Intelligent Species History on Earth had a wing dedicated to human preconsolidation culture, and one of the exhibits was a holographic reconstruction of a human warship from that era, based on archaeological extrapolation from fragmentary remains. The reconstruction was speculative, the museum placard had said, because no complete vessel from the period had ever been found. Until now. If you're enjoying this story, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I really want to know what you think this warship is and why it was buried in an asteroid, so drop your best guesses in the comments below. Now back to the story. Torven sat in his mining rig and stared at the ship and thought about human beings. He had met humans. They were common enough in the Confederation, one of the founding species, numerous and influential, and in Torven's personal experience somewhat exhausting. They were loud, emotionally demonstrative, and prone to making decisions based on intuition rather than analysis, traits that Torven, as a Kethari, found both confusing and slightly alarming. But they were also responsible for a disproportionate share of the Confederation's major achievements, a fact that Torven had attributed to their sheer numbers rather than any inherent quality of the species. A pre-consolidation human warship, if that was what this was, changed that calculation. The pre-consolidation era was the period before humanity had encountered other species when they had been alone in the galaxy and had developed technologies that the later civilizations had never fully replicated. The era was poorly documented because much of its history had been lost in the conflicts that had preceded the consolidation, and the technologies of the period had become the stuff of legend and speculation. A complete vessel from that era, especially a warship of this size and apparent sophistication, would be the most significant archaeological find in human history. It would also be worth an enormous amount of money, more money than Torven had ever seen, more money than he could spend in 100 lifetimes. But first, he needed to get inside. The ship had no visible airlock or docking port on the exterior. The hull was a continuous surface, broken only by the weapon mounts and sensor arrays with no apparent means of entry. Torven circled the vessel 3 times in his rig, examining every surface before he found what he was looking for. A section of the hull near the stern, roughly 10 meters wide, had a slightly different texture than the surrounding plating. The difference was subtle, visible only at close range and at specific angles of illumination, but it was there. A door hidden in the hull's surface, designed to be invisible to casual observation. Torven positioned his rig against the hidden door and extended the cutting laser. Before he activated it, he paused. The ship was emitting energy, active systems. If he cut through the door, those systems might respond in ways he couldn't predict. He was a miner, not a soldier or an engineer. His rig was designed for extracting ore, not for exploring ancient warships. But he was also a Kethari, and Kethari were nothing if not mechanically adept. His 4 arms and his spatial reasoning had been evolved for exactly this kind of work, the manipulation of complex physical systems in 3-dimensional space. If anyone could figure out how to get inside an alien ship without breaking anything important, it was a Kethari. As he cut through the door, the amber composite resisted the laser, but it yielded slowly and evenly, the cut line glowing with a heat that Torven's rig's thermal sensors registered as surprisingly low. The material was dissipating heat far more efficiently than any known composite, which meant it had been designed to resist exactly this kind of intrusion. But it was not impenetrable, and after 20 minutes of careful cutting, Torven had created an opening large enough for his rig to pass through. Beyond the door was a hangar bay. It was dark, lit only by the faint glow of his rig's external lights, and it was empty of craft but not empty of detail. The bay was large enough to hold a dozen ships the size of his rig, and the walls were lined with equipment racks and maintenance systems that were dark but intact. The floor was marked with painted lines that delineated parking positions and traffic lanes, and the paint was still visible after however many millennia the ship had been buried, which meant the bay's atmosphere had been maintained. Torven checked his rig's external sensors. The bay was pressurized. Atmosphere was present, roughly 20% oxygen and 78% nitrogen, with trace elements. The temperature was 18 degrees Celsius. The ship was maintaining a habitable environment in a compartment that had been sealed inside an asteroid for what might have been 15,000 years. He sealed his rig's cockpit, cycled through the airlock, and stepped out onto the bay floor on his own legs. The gravity was slightly lower than standard, perhaps 90% of Confederation norm, and the air was clean and tasteless, recycled so many times that it had lost any character it might once have had. His 4 boots made soft sounds on the deck, and the sound echoed in the vast empty space with a quality that made the ship feel larger than it already was. He moved to the interior hatch and found it open. Beyond it, a corridor stretched into the ship, its walls lined with the same fine texturing as the exterior hull and illuminated by strips of light along the floor that glowed with a soft amber luminescence. The lights were on. Not bright but present, a low-level illumination that suggested the ship's power systems were not just in standby but actively maintaining the vessel's interior environment. Torven followed the corridor deeper into the ship. He passed compartments that his rig's database, working from the partial human preconsolidation design correlation, identified as crew quarters, a medical facility, a fabrication workshop, and a mess hall. All were intact, furnished with equipment and personal effects that had been preserved by the ship's environmental systems. The crew quarters contained bunks with personal belongings stored in lockers beside them. The medical bay had equipment that Torven could not identify, but that was clearly designed for human physiology. The fabrication workshop had machines that were dark but appeared functional. The personal effects were the most striking. Photographs in frames, the images faded but still visible. Books, their pages brittle but intact. Small personal items that had no obvious function but that clearly meant something to the people who had owned them. These were the belongings of a crew that had lived on the ship, had walked these corridors, had slept in these bunks and eaten in this mess hall. They were real people, not abstractions, and their presence was tangible in the small things they had left behind. Torven reached the ship's central section, and the corridor opened into a space that made him stop in the doorway. It was a chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 50 meters in diameter, with a ceiling that arched overhead in a dome covered in the same blue-lit lattice that he had seen in the corridor lighting, but on a much larger scale. The lattice filled the dome with a soft, pulsing light that was not quite blue and not quite amber but something in between, a color that Torven's Kethari visual system could not precisely categorize. The pulse was rhythmic, a slow, steady beat that he felt in the deck plates through the soles of his boots. At the center of the chamber was a structure. It was a column, roughly 4 meters in diameter and 12 meters tall, made of the same amber composite as the hull but translucent, allowing the pulsing light to shine through it from within. The column was covered in fine lines that glowed and shifted in patterns that were clearly structured, data streams or processing indicators, or something else entirely that Torven could not interpret. Surrounding the column, arranged in a circle on the chamber's floor, were 8 chairs. Not standard seating but complex structures that combined elements of chairs, medical apparatus, and interface systems. 5 of the chairs were empty, 3 were occupied. The figures in the chairs were human, 2 male, 1 female, wearing uniforms that bore insignia that Torven's database could not identify. They were not alive in any biological sense. They were preserved perfectly, their bodies seated in the chairs with their hands resting on the armrests and their eyes closed. The preservation was not the result of cold or chemicals. The chamber was warm and there were no preservation systems visible. The figures were simply there, intact, as if the processes of decay had been suspended by an act of will rather than an application of technology. The column pulsed, the light shifted, and a voice spoke. Not from a speaker. From the column, from the air, from the lattice on the dome, a voice that was calm and clear and carried a quality of measured authority that made Torven's chitinous plates tighten instinctively. Biological presence detected. Species, Kethari. Occupational profile consistent with mining and resource extraction activities. You are not human. The voice was not asking a question. It was stating a fact, and the fact was being assessed with a speed and precision that suggested the intelligence behind the voice was processing far more data than Torven was consciously providing. No, Torven said, I am not human. You have entered this vessel through a breach in the hull that you created with a cutting laser. You have traversed the interior corridors and examined the crew's personal effects. You are now in the command core. These actions are consistent with salvage or exploration behavior. Please state your intentions. Torven's four arms shifted at his sides, a Kethari gesture of uncertainty that he was not fully aware of making. I am a miner. I discovered this ship inside an asteroid in the bitter vein. I am assessing its value and origin. The ship is of human origin. It is designated the TNS Perseus. It was commissioned approximately 14,800 years before the present date, during the period that human historians refer to as the Ascendancy. It is a dreadnought-class vessel, the flagship of the Perseus fleet, and it carries the complete tactical and scientific archives of that fleet's campaign against an existential threat designated the Subsumption. The Subsumption, a phenomenon that reduces the complexity of intelligent systems, biological and artificial. It does not destroy, it simplifies. It was the reason this ship was built, the reason it fought, and the reason it was buried in this asteroid. Torven looked at the three preserved figures in the chairs, and them. The command staff of the Perseus, Captain Anna Reyes, Commander James Okafor, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, they chose to remain with the ship when it was sealed. Their neural patterns were integrated with the command core to serve as the anchor for the preservation system. They are not conscious. They have not been conscious since the ship was sealed. But they are present, and their presence is what maintains the integrity of the core and the archives it contains. Torven absorbed this. A human warship, 14,000 years old, buried in an asteroid in one of the most remote regions of the galaxy, carrying the archives of a war against a threat that simplified civilizations. And it had been found by a Kethari miner who had been cutting rock for 6 years to pay off debts that would never be paid. Why was it buried, he asked. To hide it not from enemies, from the Subsumption. The Subsumption locates complex systems by detecting the electromagnetic signatures of advanced technology. The asteroid's mineral composition provides a natural shielding effect that masks the Perseus's energy signature. The ship has been dormant, drawing power from a quantum vacuum energy system that produces no detectable emissions for 14,000 years. The only active system was the command core's preservation function, which operates at a power level below the Subsumption's detection threshold. Until I cut a hole in the hulls. Your cutting laser introduced an energy signature that briefly exceeded the threshold. The increase was negligible and transient, and the Subsumption's nearest projected position is approximately 800 light-years from this location. The risk of detection is minimal. However, I am required to inform you that your actions have technically compromised the ship's concealment. Technically, the probability of detection is less than 0.001%. I mention it for completeness, not as a criticism. Torven looked at the column, at the shifting patterns of light that represented processes he could not understand. What do you want? The question surprised him. He had not intended to ask it, but the intelligence behind the voice had a quality of purpose that went beyond mere function, a sense of something waiting to be unleashed, and the question had risen from his instincts before his analytical mind could suppress it. I want to deliver the archives, the intelligence said. The Perseus was not buried to preserve knowledge for its own sake. It was buried to preserve knowledge for use. The Subsumption is still active. It is still moving through the galaxy, simplifying civilizations that rise in its path. The archives contain everything the Perseus fleet learned about the Subsumption's behavior, its weaknesses, and the technologies that were developed to counter it. This information was sealed here so that it could be found by someone who could carry it to a place where it could be used. And that someone is me. You are here. The selection criteria were not based on species or status or qualifications. They were based on presence. Someone needed to be present. You are present. That's not a selection criteria. That's a coincidence. Is it? You have been mining in the bitter vein for 6 years. In that time, you have extracted ore from over 3,000 asteroids. The Perseus was inside one specific asteroid. The probability of you encountering it by chance is approximately 1 in 47 billion. You encountered it because your mining pattern brought you to this specific asteroid on this specific day. Was the pattern random, or was it guided by something you are not aware of? Torven was quiet. He had no answer to that. His mining pattern was not random. It was systematic, a grid-based approach that covered the vein in overlapping sweeps. But the grid had been his own design based on his own analysis of the vein's composition, and he had not been guided by anything other than his own judgment. The intelligence's suggestion that his presence here was anything other than coincidence felt like an invasion of his autonomy, an implication that his choices were not his own. "I don't believe in fate," he said. Neither did Captain Reyes. She believed in preparation. She prepared the Perseus, sealed it in the asteroid, and left it where someone with the right skills and the right circumstances might find it. She did not know who would find it. She did not know when. She only knew that the archives needed to survive, and that survival required concealment followed by discovery. You are the discovery. Torven looked at the three figures in the chairs. Captain Anna Reyes, Commander James Ockhaffer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, three people who had sat in these chairs 14,000 years ago and had given their consciousness to a machine so that a warning could survive the dark. They had not known him. They had not known his species or his name or his reasons for being in the bitter vein. They had only known that someone needed to come, and they had trusted that someone would. "I'm a miner," Torven said again. "I extract things from rocks and sell them. That's what I do." You are a being with 4 arms, exceptional spatial reasoning, and the ability to operate complex machinery in 3-dimensional environments. You are, in the terminology of Captain Reyes' era, an engineer. The fact that you apply your engineering skills to mining rather than to ship construction or scientific research does not diminish their applicability. "You're flattering me. I am describing you. There is a difference." Torven moved to the nearest empty chair and examined it. The structure was complex, a combination of seating, medical interfaces, and data connection points that was clearly designed to integrate a human body with the command core systems. The chair was not designed for Kethari physiology. It was designed for humans, with specific anatomical features that would not accommodate Torven's different frame. "The chairs are for human neural integration," the intelligence said. "You cannot use them, but you do not need to. The archives can be accessed through the column's external interface, which is compatible with any data system capable of establishing a connection. Your mining rig's computer is sufficient." "How much data are we talking about?" "The complete tactical and scientific archives of the Perseus fleet. Approximately 900 terabytes of compressed data, including detailed analyses of the Subsumption's behavior, weapon performance metrics, defensive technology specifications, and the theoretical frameworks that were under development when the fleet was destroyed. The data is encrypted, but I will provide the decryption keys to anyone who is authorized to receive them." "Authorized by whom?" "By me, and by the 3 people whose neural patterns anchor this core. They cannot speak for themselves, but their recorded wishes are clear. The archives are to be delivered to any representative of a civilization that is capable of understanding them and willing to use them. The Confederation qualifies on both counts." Torven turned to face the column. "You're willing to give this to the Confederation, to a government that includes species other than humans." The subsumption does not distinguish between species. It simplifies any sufficiently complex intelligence, regardless of its biological origin. The threat is universal, and the response to it must be universal. Captain Reyes understood this. She was fighting the subsumption at a time when humanity believed it was the only intelligent species in the galaxy. She often expressed regret that she would not live to see the day when humanity learned it was not alone, because she believed that a coalition of species would be far more effective against the subsumption than humanity could be alone. Torven thought about the Confederation. He had complicated feelings about it, as most Kethari did. The Confederation was dominated by humans and Valyrians, and Kethari interests were often subordinate to the priorities of the larger species. But the Confederation was also the only multi-species political structure in the galaxy, and if the Subsumption was as universal a threat as the intelligence described, it was the only organization capable of mounting a coordinated response. "I'll take it to them," Torven said. The column's light shifted. The patterns on its surface changed, becoming more complex and more active, and Torven felt a subtle change in the chamber's atmosphere, a sense of something beginning that had been paused for a very long time. The data transfer will require a physical connection between your rig's computer and the column's external interface. I will guide you through the process. The transfer will take approximately 6 hours. And then you will carry the archives to the Confederation. I recommend a direct approach. The data is too important for quiet channels. Present yourself to the nearest Confederate military installation and request an immediate audience with the highest available authority. The archives will speak for themselves. Torven looked at the column, at the shifting patterns of light that represented the accumulated knowledge of a fleet that had fought an existential threat 14,000 years ago. He thought about the 3 people in the chairs who had given everything so that this moment could happen. And he thought about himself, a Kethari miner with debts and regrets, standing in the command core of a human warship that had been waiting longer than human civilization had existed. 6 hours, he said, I'll get my rig. The transfer took 7 hours, not 6, because the interface between the column and the mining rig's computer required adapters that Torven had to fabricate from spare parts. He worked in the hangar bay, his 4 hands moving with the speed and precision that were his species' birthright, assembling connectors and cables that bridged the gap between 14,000-year-old human technology and the comparatively primitive systems of a Kethari mining rig. The intelligence guided him through the process with a patience that was both reassuring and faintly irritating, as if it were accustomed to working with beings who needed more help. Torven felt he required. While the transfer progressed, Torven explored the ship more thoroughly. He visited the engine room, a vast space at the stern of the vessel that contained propulsion systems of a type he had never encountered. The engines were intact and, according to the intelligence, fully operational. The ship could fly. The quantum vacuum energy system that powered the preservation core could also power the engines, the weapons, and every other system on the vessel. "The ship is operational?" Torven asked, unable to keep the astonishment out of his voice. "The ship is fully operational. All systems were placed in a deep standby state when the vessel was sealed, designed to be restored to full functionality by a simple power initialization sequence. The sequence has already been completed. The Perseus is ready for flight." "You're telling me this ship can fly after 14,000 years?" "I am telling you this ship was designed to fly after 14,000 years. The entire vessel was engineered for long-term dormancy. The hull material is self-repairing. The power system draws energy from the quantum vacuum, which is effectively infinite. The preservation core maintains the command staff and the archives indefinitely. The only thing the ship could not do was wake itself up. It needed an external trigger. You provided that trigger when you cut through the hull." Torven stood in the engine room and looked at the propulsion systems that had been sleeping for 14 millennia and were now awake and ready. And he felt the scale of what he had stumbled into pressing down on him with a weight that made his exoskeleton feel heavier than it already was. This was not a salvage find. This was a fully operational warship from a lost era of human history, carrying archives that could change the course of galactic civilization, and it had been sitting in his asteroid claim waiting for him to cut it free. "Can I fly it?" he asked. "The command systems are designed for human neural integration. Without a human operator integrated with the command core, the ship can operate under my direction but with limitations. I can navigate, manage power distribution, and operate defensive systems. I cannot operate the weapons at full effectiveness without a human command authority. However, for the purpose of traveling to Confederate space, my capabilities are sufficient. Then we go. The Perseus emerged from the asteroid like a creature shedding its shell. The remaining rock fell away from the hull in fragments that tumbled slowly in the microgravity of the bitter vein, and the ship hung in the void for the first time in 14,000 years, its hull gleaming in the faint light of the distant dying star. The amber composite caught the light and held it, giving the vessel a quality of warm presence that was almost organic, as if the ship were not a machine but a living thing that had been sleeping and was now stretching in the morning light. The engines ignited, not with the crude thrust of chemical rockets or the measured pulse of conventional FTL drives, but with a smooth, silent acceleration that Torven felt as a change in the texture of the deck beneath his feet rather than a physical sensation of movement. The stars shifted and the bitter vein fell away behind them, and the Perseus moved toward Confederate space at a speed that made Torven's mining rig, still docked in the hangar, look like the primitive piece of equipment it was. The journey took 4 days. During that time, Torven split his time between the command core, where he monitored the data transfer, and the crew quarters, where he examined the personal effects of the people who had lived on the ship. The photographs were the most compelling. Faded images of human faces, men and women in uniforms or civilian clothes, smiling at the camera with the particular intensity of people who know they are creating a record for people they may never see again. There were group photos of the crew, dozens of faces arranged in rows, and individual photos of people in settings that ranged from the utilitarian to the beautiful. A woman standing on a cliff overlooking an ocean. A man holding a child on his shoulders. 2 people in dress uniforms, their arms around each other, their faces closed together. These people had known they were going to fight something that might kill them. They had left these photos behind because they couldn't carry them into battle, and the ship had preserved them with the same care it had preserved the archives and the command staff, as if the personal belongings of the crew were as important as the tactical data. The intelligence noticed his interest. The crew's personal effects were preserved at Captain Reyes' specific request. She believed that the people who found the ship should understand that the Perseus was not just a weapon, it was a home. The people who served on it had lives and relationships and dreams that were separate from their military function. She wanted the finders to see that. She was thoughtful. She was human. Thoughtfulness in her observation was not a separate quality from humanity. It was a defining characteristic of it. She often said that the thing that made humans most human was not their intelligence or their technology, but their inability to stop caring about things that didn't need to be cared about. She considered it both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. Torven thought about that. He had known humans who fit that description, people who cared about things that were none of their concern, who got involved in situations that had nothing to do with them, who made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. He had found those traits irritating. But Captain Reyes had apparently considered them essential, and Captain Reyes had fought a war against a threat that simplified civilizations. And if anyone was qualified to judge what made civilizations worth preserving, it was someone who had risked everything to preserve one. The Perseus dropped out of FTL at the edge of Confederate space. The intelligence detected a patrol vessel on routine patrol roughly 2 light-years away and immediately began transmitting an identification signal on standard Confederate frequencies. Unidentified vessel, this is the Confederate patrol cutter Sentinel. You have entered Confederate territorial space without authorization. Transmit your identification and intentions immediately. The intelligence responded with a transmission that was clearly not from any standard Confederate communication system. This is the TNS Perseus, a human vessel of pre-consolidation origin. I am carrying archives of critical strategic importance for the Confederate government. I request immediate escort to the nearest secure facility. I am not hostile. My weapons systems are deactivated. I am transmitting identification codes that will verify my origin and the authenticity of my archives. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 minutes. Then the sentinel responded, its voice carrying the carefully controlled tone of someone who was relaying information to superiors and waiting for instructions. Perseus, please maintain your current position and speed. Do not activate any systems. An escort is being dispatched. Do not deviate from your present course. The intelligence complied. The Perseus held position, its amber hull gleaming in the starlight, its ancient systems humming with a power that had been sleeping since before the Confederation existed. Torven stood in the command core and watched the sensor display as the Confederate response mobilized, patrol vessels converging from multiple directions, their transponder codes identifying them as military assets of increasing size and capability. They're taking it seriously, Torven said. They are taking it correctly. An unidentified vessel of unknown capability entering Confederate space with claims of critical strategic data is a scenario that their protocols are designed to handle with extreme caution. The escalation of their response indicates that my identification codes were verified and that the archive's metadata was recognized as authentic. You can tell that from here. I can detect their communication traffic. They are transmitting on encrypted channels, but the encryption is based on mathematical principles that I was able to analyze and defeat within the first 90 seconds of contact. I am not reading the content of their transmissions. I am reading the volume and routing patterns, which tell me how seriously they are treating the situation. That's somewhat unsettling. It is a capability that was designed into me for exactly this circumstance. The Perseus was built to operate behind enemy lines, in environments where information superiority was a matter of survival. The ability to analyze and defeat enemy communications without being detected is a core function. The escort arrived in 6 hours. A task force of 8 vessels, including a heavy cruiser that was the largest warship Torven had ever seen, arranged in a formation that surrounded the Perseus with overlapping fields of fire. A delegation transferred to the Perseus via shuttle, docking in the hangar bay next to Torven's mining rig, which looked so small and primitive in the vast space that Torven felt a sudden, unexpected embarrassment on its behalf. The delegation was led by an admiral, a human woman named Okonkwo, whose face bore the particular expression of someone who had been briefed on something extraordinary and was now seeing it with her own eyes and discovering that the briefing had not been exaggerated. She was accompanied by a team of specialists, human and Valyrian and Torsen, whose equipment was state-of-the-art and whose expressions ranged from awe to skepticism to the careful neutrality of people who had learned to reserve. A judgment. Torven met them in the command core. He had asked the intelligence to maintain the chamber as it was, with the column and the chairs and the preserved command staff, because he wanted the delegation to see what they were dealing with before the briefings began. The chamber had the same impact on the delegates that it had on Torven. They stood in the pulsing light and looked at the 3 figures in the chairs and at the column that held the archives of a fleet that had been dead for 14,000 years. And they were very quiet. Okonkwo was the first to speak, Captain Reyes. Captain Reyes, Torven confirmed, and Commander Okafor and Lieutenant Commander Chen, no relation to you, I assume. None that I'm aware of, but the name is not uncommon. Okonkwo looked at the preserved woman in the command chair. She looks like she's sleeping. She is sleeping in a sense. The intelligence says her neural patterns are preserved as a reference for the core stability. She's not conscious, but she's present. You're a Kethari. Oh yes. Oh, you found this ship. Oh yes. The hell? Torven told the story. The mining claimed, the cutting laser, the amber reflection, the 3 weeks of excavation, the slow revelation of what lay inside the asteroid. He told it without embellishment, in the flat, factual tone that Kethari favored for narrative, and when he finished, Okonkwo looked at him with an expression that he couldn't quite interpret. "You could have reported this through normal channels and claimed a finder's fee," she said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" Torven thought about the question. He had been expecting it, and he had prepared an answer that was logical and self-serving, something about maximizing the value of the find by controlling the initial contact. But looking at Captain Reyes' face at the young woman who had sat in that chair and had given her consciousness to a machine so that a warning could survive, the prepared answer felt inadequate. "Because she trusted someone would come," Torven said quietly. "She didn't know who, she didn't know when, she just trusted. And if I had reported this through normal channels, it would have been 6 months before anyone came, and by then the bureaucracy would have taken over and Captain Reyes would have been a specimen in a jar. She deserved better than that. They all did." Alconquo was quiet for a long time, then she turned to the column. "Intelligence, I need to verify the archives. Can you provide access?" "I can provide full access to any authorized representative of a civilization capable of understanding the data and willing to use it. You qualify on both counts. The decryption keys are being transmitted to your team's equipment now." The specialists went to work. They connected their instruments to the column's external interface and began the process of accessing and analyzing the archives. The data was encrypted in layers that took hours to penetrate, but when the first layers yielded, what the specialists found confirmed everything the intelligence had described and added details that were even more alarming than the summary had suggested. The subsumption was real. It had been active in the galaxy for at least 100,000 years, moving through the spiral arms like a slow tide, reducing civilizations that rose in its path to pre-technological states. The Perseus fleet had fought it for 60 years, roughly 14,500 years before the present, and had lost. Not quickly, but inevitably the way any force loses against entropy itself. The fleet had been destroyed, but not before its commander, Captain Reyes, had dispatched the Perseus to this location with the fleet's accumulated knowledge, sealed in the asteroid where the Subsumption could not find it. And the Subsumption was approaching Confederate space. The archives included projections based on the Subsumption's observed movement patterns that placed its leading edge within 800 light-years of the Confederation's outer boundary. At its current rate of advance, it would reach the outer colonies within 3 to 4 centuries. The data spread through the Confederate government like a shockwave. Emergency sessions were convened. Military assessments were ordered. Scientific analyses were commissioned. And at the center of it all, the Perseus sat in its dock at the Confederates' anchor station, its amber hull a silent testament to a war that had been fought and lost before human civilization had learned to write its own history. Torven was present for much of it, not as a participant but as a witness. The Confederate government had granted him temporary consultant status, a designation that gave him access to the briefings and discussions but not a voice in the decisions. He sat in the observation galleries and watched as the leaders of a dozen species grappled with a threat that none of them had known existed, and he listened to the debates about response strategies and resource allocation and political implications, and he felt the same frustration that had driven him to the bitter vein in the first place. On the 5th day of the emergency session, Torven was called to testify. He stood before the Confederate Council and told his story again, but this time when he finished, he did not wait for questions. He spoke. "You are asking the wrong question," he said. "You are asking what to do about the subsumption. The archives tell you what to do about the subsumption. The technologies are there. The strategies are there. The question you should be asking is why a Kethari miner in a broken-down mining rig was the one who found this data and not the combined intelligence apparatus of the Confederation." The chamber was quiet. The Perseus was buried in an asteroid that I had a legal claim to. The signal it was emitting was on a frequency that no one monitors. The ship was hiding in the one place in the galaxy where no one was looking. If I hadn't been running a cutting laser on that particular day, in that particular place, the ship would still be hidden and you would still be ignorant. That's not a coincidence. That's a failure. A failure of curiosity, of thoroughness, of the willingness to look in the places where no one expects to find anything. The subsumption hides in the spaces that no one watches. If we're going to fight it, we need to start watching those spaces. He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. 3 weeks later, the council voted to establish the Deep Watch, a network of monitoring stations and patrol vessels designed to detect the subsumption's approach and provide early warning to the Confederation. The network would use technologies derived from the Perseus's archives, and it would be operated by a multi-species crew drawn from every member species of the Confederation. Torven was offered a commission in the Deep Watch. The offer came from Admiral Okonkwo personally, delivered in the Perseus's command core, with Captain Reyes' preserved face visible in the background. "You found the ship," Okonkwo said. "You brought it home. The Watch needs people who can find things that don't want to be found. That's what you did." "I'm a miner." "You're an engineer who applies his skills to mining. The distinction is less important than you think." Torven looked at Captain Reyes. The preserved face was calm, the features relaxed, the expression one of peace. She had sat in that chair and had looked out at a galaxy that was being slowly simplified by a force she couldn't defeat, and she had chosen to preserve what she could and trust that someone would come. "I'll do it," Torven said, "but I have a condition." "I'll name it." "The Perseus comes with me as the command vessel of the Deep Watch. It was built for this. It's been waiting for this. And Captain Reyes and her people stay where they are in that chamber as long as the ship exists." Okonkwo looked at the three figures in the chairs. "The medical assessment says they can't be revived." "I'm not asking to revive them. I'm asking to let them stay. They're part of the ship. Taking them out would be like taking the heart out of a person. Let them stay." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. "Duns." The Perseus was refitted for Deep Watch service. The damaged sections were repaired using the fabrication technology from the ship's own archives, and the systems were upgraded with modern Confederate technology where the ancient systems were incompatible with current standards. But the command core was left untouched. The column still pulsed with its amber-blue light. The chairs still held their occupants. And the intelligence, now connected to the Deep Watch's communication network, had a purpose again. Torven stood on the Perseus's bridge, a space that had been restored to something close to its original configuration, and watched the stars through the transparent dome that dominated the forward section. The ship was alive around him, its systems humming with a power that had been sleeping for 14,000 years and was now awake and ready. "Commander Hask," the intelligence said. The title was new. The Confederate Navy had granted Torven a commission equivalent to captain, and the Perseus's intelligence had adapted to the change with the same smooth efficiency it brought to everything. "Oh yes." "The Deep Watch's first operational patrol is plotted. We will be scanning a sector of the frontier approximately 400 light-years from here, in a region where the archives suggest the Subsumption's influence may already be present. The patrol will take approximately 6 weeks." "Then let's begin." The Perseus moved. Its engines burned with the silent power of a quantum vacuum energy system that drew from the fabric of space itself, and the ship slid forward into the void, past the stations and ships of the Confederation's fleet, past the Navigatio. Now buoys that marked the boundary of known space and into the frontier. The dark and empty spaces between the stars where the Subsumption waited and where the Watch would meet it. Torven sat in the command chair. Not the chair in the command core, which still belonged to Captain Reyes, but the chair on the bridge, which was his now. He was not a soldier. He was not a scientist. He was a miner who had found something that didn't belong to him and had chosen to give it to the people who could use it. And now he was the captain of a warship that was older than human civilization, leading a mission that would determine whether that civilization survived to see the stars that the Subsumption had dimmed. He thought about Captain Reyes, a woman who had fought a war she couldn't win and had lost, and who had responded to losing not with despair but with preparation. She had buried her ship in the dark and had trusted that someone would come, a Kethari miner, the most unlikely person in the galaxy, but Captain Reyes hadn't been looking for a hero, she had been looking for someone who was there, and Torven had been there. That was the lesson of the Perseus. Not that humanity could build amazing things, though it could. Not that a single person could change the course of history, though they could. The lesson was that trust was not naivety, it was strategy. Captain Reyes had trusted the future, and the future had answered. Not because the future was kind, but because someone in the future had been doing the work that made the answer possible. Torven had been doing the work. 6 years of mining, of cutting rock in the dark, of maintaining his equipment and his claim and his routine in a place where no one was watching. He had not been watching for ancient warships. He had been watching for ore deposits, but the watching itself had been the qualification, the willingness to look consistently and carefully at a universe that most people ignored. That was what Captain Reyes had designed her selection criteria to find, and that was what she had found. The stars stretched ahead. The Perseus sailed into the dark. And in the command core, the column pulsed its steady rhythm, and Captain Anna Reyes waited in her chair, as she had waited for 14,000 years with the quiet certainty that someone would come. Someone had come, and the watching had only just begun.